This is assignment 1, problem number 9. We're given a 2D array of integers, and we're asked to print the elements in a spiral. So let me quickly demonstrate what this would look like. So let's say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 in our 2D m by n array. We would be asked to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, traversing this 2 by 2 in a spiral, so going clockwise and not repeating any numbers. Let's start with the function definition. We'll call it spiralize. We're going to pass in the number of rows in our array, the number of columns, and the 2D array. Let's open up the function. Great, we're in frame. Awesome. I'm trying out a new camera holding technique. So let's initialize our counter for our for loops I. And we'll initialize two other variables, one called row count actually, let's call this RC for row count. I'll add a comment that this means row count. So RC RC for row count, and also we'll initialize, this has to be set to 0, because initially the number of rows that we have printed is going to be 0, and we'll initialize column count, which will also be 0 because we won't have printed any columns when we start. And we'll have an outer while loop where we make sure that before we start going in the clockwise direction, we have rows and columns left to print. So where row count is less than m and column count is less than n. Let's open this up. We'll have 4 for loops, one for going from left to right, one for going from top to bottom, one for going from right to left, and one from going bottom up. So we'll start our for loop for going right. We'll start I at column count because we're going to begin printing in the first column, or the 0th column. And we'll go until I hits, or until right before I hits how many columns there are. We can't print more than we have. So when we're going to the right, we will print the ith in the ith row. No. In the there we go. In the 0th row, in the ith column, close this off, and increment row count, because now we've printed the first row. So now the number of rows we've printed is 1. We'll open up our for loop for going down. Until I reaches how many rows there are. We will print out. The ith row and the n-1 column. n-1 because n is how many columns we have, but if we have 3 columns, we need to, we're indexing starting at 0, so we need to actually access the column with the index of 2. And we'll decrement n. Around these next 2 for loops for going left and going up, we're going to have an if statement just to check that there's still more to print because, well, you'll see. So if the rows we've printed is less than the rows we have, because here we had incremented row count, so we just have to check if this is still true. We'll print out the mth row. It's a hard one to say. And the ith column. And we'll decrement m. Close off this if statement. Last if statement. We'll just check if the amount of columns we've printed is less than the amount of columns we have. Open this up. Until while I is greater than or equal to row count. Decrement I. Still in view. Good. We will print out the ith row and the column count. Close off this if statement. Close off the while loop. And we're good. Let's work through this function with the let's take a smaller sample array and walk through this. So let's say our sample array is yeah, it could fit here. Let's say our sample array is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we start out with row count as 0 and column count as 0, and M is, there are 2 rows, M is 2 and N is 2. So while row count is less than M, row count is less than M, true, and column count is less than N, column count is less than N, true. Then we enter the go right for loop. So start I at 0 until I reaches N, increment I, console.writeLine. So we'll print out in the 0th row, we'll print out I equals, so we'll print out 0, 0, and then we'll increment I. We'll print out, so we printed 0, 0, and then we'll print out 0, 1, which is 2. And then we'll exit out of this because I has to be less than 2. And we'll increment row count. So row count is now 1. We enter this next block. For I equals row count. So we start at row 1 until I reaches the amount of rows we have, increment I. So we'll print out A of 1, comma, 1, which is 3. And we'll print out 1, comma 1, and we'll try to increment I, but I started at 1, and if we increment I, 2 is not less than 2, so we have to exit out of this for loop and decrement N. So now N is 1. So far we've printed 1, 2, and 3. Let's check if we can enter this go left if statement. So if row count is less than M, 1 is less than 2, we can enter. For I equals n minus 1, so I equals 0 for I greater than or equal to column count, so 0, decrement I. So we can go through this once because I starts at 1 and I has to be greater than or equal to 0. So we print out the m minus 1 row, which is 2 minus 1, which is 1. We print out row 1, column 0, which is 4. And we decrement m. Let's see. So far we printed out all the elements of this array. Let's check if we can enter this last if statement. So if column count is less than the number of columns, so if column count is less than n, which 0 is less than 1, for I equals m minus 1, so I equals 1 minus 1, I equals 0. For I greater than or equal to row count is 1. So 0 is not greater than or equal to 1, so we don't in fact print anything here, which is great because we've already printed the last element that needed to be spiralized. Let's analyze the time complexity and the space complexity for this algorithm. Space complexity is constant. We're only using a couple of variables here. Time complexity is big O of m times n because we're traversing over m times n elements where m is the number of rows and n is the number of columns.